Hello everyone and welcome yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you as always for tuning in. This is our final show here of the week. A lot to cover before we head into an exciting weekend of football action in both the NFL and college. We're first going to be looking at last night's game, an utterly dominant performance by the New York Jets at home against the New England Patriots, a nice divisional matchup. Then we're going to be looking at some last-minute high-risk, high-reward options for your fantasy team headed into Week 3. We're going to be looking at some of the most interesting games in both the NFL and college in terms of fantasy implications, and we're also going to be giving you a general injury update about some important players in terms of fantasy and how to mitigate for them. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network. Also, something that you guys have been already doing an incredible job of, making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to interact with the show, get your thoughts on air. Any questions, comments, or concerns are always accepted and appreciated by me and also my fellow podcasters. Go check them out as well. But ultimately, just to make this show even bigger and better than it already is, your guys' support and comments always help move it forward. Without further ado, let's jump right into what should be a good show to end the week and get us prepared for all the action happening over this weekend. Let's start off with a game that took place last night, actually, between the New England Patriots and the New York Jets. It was an utterly dominant performance, like I said, by the New York Jets. And it was a game in which I kind of felt like the outcome was never in doubt, right? The Patriots never really threatened to have any offensive momentum against the Jets' defensive front that was looking for a big game, and they got it. They were really good in generating pressure on Jacoby Brissett. He was really uncomfortable all night long, and ultimately the Jets really got a very important win for themselves. They moved to 2-1. The Patriots fall to 1-2, and this game leaves them with perhaps more questions than answers. But overall, in terms of fantasy implications, it really wasn't very heavy in terms of star power. You know what I mean? There wasn't one true superstar in this. This was a very competent, overall, well-rounded win for the New York Jets. But there wasn't really something that I could point to and say, this really stuck out to me over everything the Jets did. But that being said, there were some performances that were of note for both teams, actually, even though the Patriots only ended up scoring 3 points. Let's start off with the man, the myth, the legend, Aaron Rodgers himself, a guy who I had big expectations for heading into this year. Talked about all the pressure he was facing in his first home game as a New York Jet. He was vintage Aaron Rodgers, whether it be out of structure, in the pocket, just looked very comfortable. He looked 5 years younger, like the broadcast crew was saying during the game. And he was just getting the ball to all different levels of the field and just keeping this offense on schedule. 27 of 35, 281 yards, 2 TDs, 21 fantasy points for Aaron Rodgers. Even some chants in the crowd to boot for him. So overall, a very comfortable performance. Like I said, one that really wasn't going to prove to you that he was a high-end QB1 for your fantasy team, but also one that really goes to show that he still has it in him to have big games like this and get wins for the Jets. Most importantly, this looked like a Jets offense that we all know it can be. This looked like a perhaps Super Bowl contending offense with what they had. Now let's look at Breece Hall, a guy who has kind of had a stop-start season to start off with. 16 carries, 54 yards, 4 catches for 29, and a total of 18.3 fantasy points. So with his performance, I'm a little bit concerned because the emergence of Braylon Allen is something to monitor, but also because of the way he has to help this backfield, right? If he's going to be the RB1 in this backfield like I presume he is, and play like what many people thought he was, a guy who was worth taking number 2 overall in a fantasy draft, then he really needs to find a rhythm with Aaron Rodgers. Find moments where, whether it be in the running game or the receiving game, he just makes himself available. It is highly contingent on the O-line, they're continuing to cohere with each other. But at the end of the day, Breece Hall really needs to get to a level in which he can put up competent fantasy performances week in, week out. And I just don't know if he is there just yet. And then a final look into this Jets overall roster in terms of fantasy. Garrett Wilson. Again, a performance in which there was nothing to be really hyped about if you're a Garrett Wilson owner. There was a reason I had benched him before. He only did have 14.3 fantasy points, 5 catches, 9 targets, 33 yards. Did have the 1 touchdown, but it was a short one at that. But at this moment in time, I feel comfortable in saying that when I look at Garrett Wilson in the system, I feel like, yes, Aaron Rodgers is trying to distribute the ball to players he may know better, may feel more comfortable with. And, Garrett Wilson at this point isn't one of them at the moment. But at the end of the day, he is still projected to be their wide receiver 1. I'm not as worried about him as others on this team. It's just that Aaron Rodgers has a lot of mouths to feed, and he has had that relationship with Allen Lazard, who really kind of was the bell cow in terms of the receivers in this offense last night. Then a guy who I kind of was surprised by here was Tyler Conklin, a tight end. A guy who kind of falls to the wayside when we talk about quote-unquote high-end or overall tight ends. He had 5 catches on 6 targets for 93 yards, 14.3 fantasy points. What I loved about him was that he was always adjusting his route for whatever Aaron Rodgers was doing. If Aaron Rodgers escaped the pocket, he adjusted his route to help him in that situation. So look for Tyler Conklin to be a sneaky good tight end as well, if you're kind of panicking already about your tight ends, because it is a very volatile market. As Peyton enters the chat, Ayuk or Charbonnet for this weekend? Very, very interesting question here. Ayuk, let's talk about him first, is someone who, as Sheppy Sweet Spot says, a.k.a. Tyler Gronklin. Yes, Tyler Gronklin, Tyler Conklin, whatever you want to call him, showed up and showed out. But I do want to get to Pate's question here about Ayuk and Charbonnet. Here's the thing about both of these players, right? On the San Fran side of things, they are playing another banged-up team in the LA Rams, a very important divisional game. So you feel like Brock Purdy will do the best to get it to the weapons he has, right? He only has right now 2 players who I believe can be quote-unquote stars right now in the system, in Mason, the new running back, and Brandon Ayuk. And so I expect that if Brock Purdy has a clean pocket, he'll be able to find Ayuk early and often in this game. Whereas Zach Charbonnet, even as a Seattle fan, I'm saying this as a Seattle fan, only profiles to me as someone who is either a third and short situational back or a short yardage receiving back. I don't see a world in which Zach Charbonnet will have a crazy big game. Maybe as an RB2 in a deeper league, you could get away with it. But this week, I don't pretend to see him as someone who immediately fits into this Seattle system. And I can see it clearly in this new system with Ryan Grubb that Kenneth Walker is the better fit in that Seattle running back room right now. So while I think that Zach Charbonnet is good at what he does, it's not necessarily going to be effective in terms of putting up good fantasy stats. So for this week, even though it's a bit risky, and I don't know how the 49ers offense will look sans all these players, I'm going with Brandon Ayuk there. Thank you for your question. Keep them coming if you have any questions about trade advice, who to start in certain situations, things of that nature. They're always welcome. Getting back to looking at this Thursday night football game and recapping it in terms of the fantasy implications, we have to talk about the ugly as well as what the good was. And the ugly was the New England Patriots. They did not look confident. They did not look competent. They did not look comfortable on the offensive side of the football. They were utterly overmatched. And this was the first time where I really had concern about Ramondre Stevenson in this system. Ramondre Stevenson had very few yards in this game. He looked like he was very frustrated early in this game. And overall, the game plan did not work against a Jets team that just looked more spry in this game. But let's talk about some of the fantasy implications from this Patriots performance. Let's start with Jacoby Brissett. 12 of 18 for only 98 yards, 3.92 fantasy points. And the thing with him is that not many people like him, but he's good for what he is. This game was not necessarily indicative of how you should view Jacoby Brissett as an overall player. He's had some good performances no matter where he's been. This just felt like it was a game he couldn't win. He couldn't overcome all the deficiencies of this offense, and ultimately it caved in on itself. And that's why I think you saw Drake May out there. Jacoby Brissett was just so frustrated, so in anguish over what he couldn't do with this offense, utterly helpless, to the point where they said, hey, Drake May can have the final couple minutes in this game. But overall, I don't think that this is a performance that indicates that Jacoby Brissett is either not worthy of being put on a fantasy football team, or in that case that he should be. It's just one of those really, really bad performances by a backup quarterback who wasn't really expected to be a fantasy starter or QB2 in the first place. So Jacoby Brissett's always going to be weird, because out of all the quote-unquote backups here, or starters who project to be backups in the future, I think that he's one who can have a solid game, but most of the time, because of whether the ineptitudes of the offense he's in, or because he's simply overmatched, most of the time you would never consider him in the first place. But what was really a bright spot, so to speak, if I want to call it a bright spot in such a terrible game for them, was the emergence of Demario Douglas. 7 catches, 9 targets, 69 yards, 14.8 fantasy points. And I was talking about before that in order for the Patriots to really prove themselves an offense that can expand outside of Ramondre Stevenson, Demario Douglas or any Patriots receiver had to step up, and Demario Douglas kind of did. In the moments where Jacoby Brissett had a clean pocket, he was finding Demario Douglas. Demario Douglas was getting open in return for him, and so they clicked immediately. Now, in terms of the futures for both of these teams, for the Jets, this is a very good example of what this offense could look like when all cylinders are firing. For the Patriots, this is just one of those games where you have to get over, accept it, accept the fact that you were overmatched as well, and just get on with it. Now you kind of have to set on a new game plan, start again, rinse and repeat, so to speak, because this game is just a game where you were forced into a game in which you can never win. And so, make of it what you will, but this game was really not a fun one to recap in terms of fantasy implications. But let me know what you think about this game in the comments. Let me know about who were your fantasy stars who did not step up to the plate. But coming up next, we're looking at some final high-risk, high-reward players that you might want to see in your fantasy squad for this weekend. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on their fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, if you have any burning questions, comments, concerns, or even want to leave a tip or donation in the comments section, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features. They're an excellent way to interact with the show, get your opinions on the air, if you so choose. I always love this interactive environment that we are creating with this show. So, if you so choose, leave a comment in the comments section. I will get to them when I can. And let's make this show even bigger and better than it already is. Without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment of today's show, talking about some either final additions to your roster or just high-risk, high-reward players that might be fun to put into your fantasy football squad in any capacity for this week. And let's start off with the long shot one that many of you guys might be skeptical about. Let's talk about Malik Willis. This could potentially be his final game as the starter for the Green Bay Packers, as Jordan Love's timeline to return has grown shorter, and it could be by week 4 when they go up against the Vikings in their first divisional game of the year. So, against his former team, mind you, going back, knowing most of the players on that team, familiar with, maybe not the coaching staff, but maybe familiar with some of the coaching philosophies there. This just feels like a nothing-to-lose kind of game for Malik Willis. And yes, he's not going to have many passing yards. He might not even have many pass attempts. He only had 14 in that game against Indy. But this could be a game where Matt LaFleur lets caution go to the wind here. This could be a game where Matt LaFleur says, we have one win already in the situation, and whether we're 1-2 or 2-1, we're in a better spot than we think because Jordan Love's timeline is shorter. So why not allow Malik Willis, potentially his final start on our team, against his former team, ironically, just be let loose. And they have the receivers to do it if they want to. It's just all about Malik Willis playing timely football, complementary football, and most importantly, protecting the football when the offense is on the field. As much as I love seeing Josh Jacobs, the new addition to this running back room, break out, have good games, have a lot of touches, I think that this could be a surprising game for Malik Willis, where you see the true side of what Malik Willis could be and could have been had he stayed in Tennessee. So, it's just a fun little experiment. Maybe not a starter, but just to see, maybe in a deeper league, a 2 QB league, you can have him on your bench, and if he performs well, and maybe even if we hear news that perhaps the Jordan Love injury is worse than we thought in the coming weeks, then maybe Malik Willis could be an interesting contingency plan for the time being. But for now, he's just a fun, frisky player to mess around with in fantasy. And then let's talk about a guy who's already on a lot of people's radar, may still be on the waiver wire in some leagues, but is becoming more and more of an X factor for this Baltimore Ravens squad, and that is Isaiah Likely. I think that over the past few weeks, we've seen two sides of the Ravens. One where the passing game looks very limited, and one where Lamar Jackson is starting to trust certain targets. And one of those targets is Isaiah Likely. And the reason why I think that Lamar Jackson is trusting Isaiah Likely is because he's someone who plays the tight end position in many different ways. He doesn't play necessarily as just a tight end, as someone who either blocks or runs seam routes all the time. He plays it in a way to help his quarterback. And I think that's what Lamar Jackson wants, because with this offensive line that's kind of struggling a little bit, whether it be the struggles of Patrick McCarry, whether it be some of the injuries along the line, it has been one of the weaknesses that we've seen in these two games for this Baltimore Ravens offense. And to mitigate for it, you need a reliable X-factor kind of target. And for Lamar, surprisingly, it's been Isaiah Likely. Now, obviously, Mark Andrews doesn't look like himself early on in the season. He is recovering from an injury sustained last season. But at the end of the day, I still think right now, at this current moment in time, Isaiah Likely looks like the more comfortable of the two in this system. And he's kind of like the scapegoat security blanket of this offense right now. So it means a ton more targets, a ton more yardage for Isaiah Likely. So no matter what league you're in, especially maybe in a PPR league where targets are at a premium, Isaiah Likely could be the guy for you going forward. Another guy who's going to be even more and more of an X factor in his respective team is Marvin Harrison Jr. Really had a breakout game against LA last week, and I think that he's just going to continue to grow in this system. I think him and Kyler are finally over the hump in terms of working things out together, and so they're going to settle into a rapport together as QB and wide receiver one. And there was a little bit of worry about Kyler commenting on whether or not he's responsible for getting Marvin Harrison Jr. targets, and I don't think he really is. I think it comes naturally. The flow of this Arizona Cardinals offense is the most important thing about it. If, they're not connecting early enough, then so be it. It just matters that this Arizona Cardinals offense really gels together, and it really is the first couple of games. They hung tough with a tough Buffalo Bills team on the road, and they beat up on the LA Rams. Yes, it was a team that was heavily depleted, without a lot of its weapons, which we'll talk about later. But it's still the LA Rams. It's still a divisional game, which we expect to be competitive. And Marvin Harrison Jr. showed up and showed out in that game. So, no matter what you hear from the media, no matter what rumors you hear about the disconnect between certain players on that team, I think everything will be just fine. And through 2 weeks so far, everything seems to have clicked, no matter who's getting the ball in that Arizona Cardinals offense. So Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to get more fun to look at, going to be more involved in this Arizona Cardinals offensive system as the true wide receiver one that Kyler Murray wants and needs. And so, as the season progresses, you're going to worry less and less about him in your team. Now let's talk about a guy who a lot of you already might have on your roster, one of the best tight ends in the league, perhaps even the third best tight end in all of fantasy football, Dalton Kincaid. Now, this offense really is starting to get a little bit less Allen-centric and playing it a little bit safer, right? We see a lot of more big games out of James Cook in recent games, and we've seen a lot more short passes. We haven't seen Josh Allen really get vertical just yet in this offense. And so, the reason why I think Dalton Kincaid can be a big X factor here is if there's a game when a certain defense is generating more pressure than they expected, then Josh Allen will have a nice scapegoat in Dalton Kincaid. I love the routes that Dalton Kincaid runs. Very well versed for such a young player. And in this Bills system, eventually you're going to have to find short yardage plays that can generate you enough yards to keep you on schedule. That's the basic tenets of this Buffalo Bills offense. Setting a tempo, keeping a rhythm, keeping on schedule. And I think Dalton Kincaid perfectly embodies every single trait of that kind of offense. So Dalton Kincaid is always going to be a sneaky good weapon at the tight end position for you. And then let's look at some players who might step up in terms of replacing players due to injury. Well, I can tell you right now, kind of foreshadowing to a future segment, that this guy may not have as big a role this week, but Brandon Powell, man. Let's talk about him a little bit. As I said, kind of foreshadowing, he might not have a bigger role, and you know what that means if you're a Vikings fan or just a fan of the league in general. But he is someone who is going to be very valuable for this Vikings team should, things go awry. And yes, I know that once everyone's healthy, he immediately falls down the pecking order. But over the past couple of years, he's shown that he's competent in certain areas of the field, very effective in the red zone especially. And I love him as a short yardage guy that can keep this team on schedule, especially against tougher teams when Sam Darnold will be facing more pressure. So look for Brandon Powell, even, as he drops down the pecking order, to be someone that Sam Darnold might like to have in the red zone as a kind of red zone threat against tougher opponents, much like what he was against San Fran this past week. But The last player that I want to touch on is actually a player who really needs to step up in crisis mode, and that is Jawan Jennings. We talked about Brandon Ayuk, as Pate mentioned, being in a bigger role in this game. How about Jawan Jennings, a guy who has really got under the radar for the San Francisco 49ers over the past couple of years, but really has been one of the most integral players in keeping them on schedule with this offense. Like, he's no slouch. Just because, he doesn't get as many targets as Debo, as Ayuk, as Kittle in this offense, he can move the chains. He's very savvy in terms of his route running abilities. And now that they're down to so many people, he immediately becomes someone whose intelligence can get this offense further than we expect, down to many injuries, and really can keep Brock Purdy, who has shown that he struggles more without all of his pieces in place, on schedule. So the importance of, looking at teams that have depth to them and experience to them, most importantly, can really help you in terms of getting into the win column in fantasy football. But overall, let me know what you think about this list. I think in terms of trying to interpret all of these players who potentially be boom or bust, it's all down to, whether or not you feel they have longevity and whether or not you're well versed in the injuries. We're going to have a little segment later about all the injuries and updates around the league. But at the end of the day, just keep your mind on the waiver wire more than anything, because chances are you're going to find more and more gems, even in situations where, injury might happen or might not happen, or these players are just performing beyond what we thought of them. Like I mentioned, there are so many players outside of this list who could have been on it, but right now, these are my players. Let me know what you think about them in the comments. But coming up next, we're going to take a look at some of the most interesting games in the NFL this weekend in terms of fantasy implications, whether it be because of injury, whether it be because some fascinating fantasy matchups on offense and defense are taking place, or even just vintage rivalries. We'll be right back to talk about that right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you are enjoying the show thus far. I really have. Thank you for all the comments from you guys. But we are now focusing our attention on perhaps some of the most important games, most interesting games for that matter, in terms of fantasy implications. We talked about a lot of different players who could fit into your squad, whether it be high-risk, high-reward guys, or guys who can get the job done for you. But in each of these games, there's a different storyline in terms of whether it be injury crises or plain old rivalries or just solid matchups all across the board that really stand out, and also in terms of fantasy storylines are highly integral to potentially getting you a win or a difference between winning and losing. Without further ado, let's look at some of the biggest games of the weekend, starting off with a divisional game that really has kind of lost its luster, but is now kind of asking a bigger question out of both of these teams, and that is the 49ers against the Rams. Now, I apologize in advance for the question on the screen. This before I knew about the Cup injury, but the question now that can be asked is an even bigger one. Which of these teams' secondary options can step up? You look at the 49ers and you think, well, they still have Brandon Ayuk and Jawan Jennings. Both of these guys are very savvy. They're very smart in terms of their route running abilities. They're very smart in terms of knowing Brock Purdy's tendencies, and so they can keep on schedule. But we've seen time and time again, Brock Purdy kind of does struggle without most, if not all, of his weapons around him. And it's slowly looking like he'll be without potentially all of them for this game. We'll mention what's happening with most of them in a further segment, but at this current moment in time, I really think this game is a story about how to view kind of waiver wire level players, or players that you didn't necessarily know about, because both of these teams are really going to be called into question. Let's look on the Rams side of things, because they're really in deep trouble right now in this game. Because losing Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua is a ton of fantasy value to mitigate for. And also the fact that they're dropping like flies on the offensive line. Jonah Jackson now out. You already know about Joe Noteboom and Steve Avila along the offensive line. So this game really feels like it's going to be underwhelming on many levels, because both of these teams are worrying about certain players. And the irony about it is that there really doesn't pretend to be a quote-unquote favorite for this game right now. Yes, once you look at all the weapons that 49ers have, you think that their contingency plan is going to be the one most liable to work. But this game could feel like it could go either way, because both of these teams are struggling. And we see early on in the season with teams like the 49ers and Rams who have so much talent, when they do lose a player, they do tend to struggle. And it's usually only later in the season when they've fixed everything and have kind of contingency plans set that they can mitigate for losses. But right now, both of these teams feel like they're kind of in crisis mode, in panic mode a little bit. But for now, the big question is, can anyone from this game outside of, say, Ayuk and Jennings really step up for either team? If I'm the Rams, I'm looking at Kyron Williams to really step up, because now he's the potential star of this offense, and he really hasn't gotten going so far. I'm also looking at guys like Tutu Atwell. Maybe he can use his speed to good effect in this offense, get a lot of touches in many different ways. He's very valuable in terms of like the jet sweeps they run, the motions they run. So look for Tutu Atwell maybe to be a big star. Demarcus Robinson, just a chain-moving tight end, very smart, good red zone threat. And also Colby Parkinson, how about him? As a Seattle fan, I know he's good for a game or two of fantastic production. So this Rams team certainly feels like it's in a much different spot than what they were expecting. That doesn't mean that there can't be talent gleaned from this roster right now. There can't be good performances gleaned from this roster. So it's going to be all about secondary options and trying to find hidden gems in this game for now. Let's go to another game. A game that I'm really excited about. Very intrigued by this matchup, and not just as a fan. Dolphins-Seahawks. And one of the big questions that kind of lost its luster when Tua went down is if the Seattle defense is legit. And I still think this question stands, because even though it's a different QB, it's still the same players around him. And I didn't mention in a segment where I said don't be surprised if a backup QB like Skylar Thompson finishes top 15 in terms of fantasy. And not to, kind of add pressure on the Dolphins, but kind of breaking news right now. The Dolphins do pretend to be without Raheem Mostert for this game, which means that it's really going to fall on Skylar Thompson in the screen action game, and also, Devon Achane potentially having to step up, because, like I said, before the season even started, I had my qualms about Devon Achane in this offense. And actually the overall prospect of this offense is just very speedy players doing the same kind of thing. But now it's still the question of, well, how do we use the weapons we have if you're Mike McDaniel? And on the Seattle side of things, the defense through 2 weeks has been perhaps its most impressive unit. Mike Macdonald really has brought a sense of cohesiveness, togetherness to this unit at all three levels, and they're certainly kind of firing on all cylinders right now. But the fact of the matter is, they only played the Denver Broncos and the New England Patriots, so they haven't really been tested. And while they just lost a big part of that test, with Tua not being there for Miami, you still have to contend for all these different pieces. You still have to account for all the different weapons that these players have. As Shep Easy's Sweet Spot comments about a certain starting situation for his quarterbacks, Derek Carr or Sam Darnold to start. Again, another very interesting question about two guys who potentially were on the waiver wire to start your season. In terms of Derek Carr, nobody saw him coming. The Saints offense certainly looks like one of the best in the league right now, and it certainly seems like they have no signs of slowing down. I think their schedule is definitely going to be pretty easy going forward, and whereas Sam Darnold, his schedule is toughening up, but he's already beaten perhaps the best team in the NFC, and to boot, for most of the game without some of his biggest weapons. It's a really tough question. But at the end of the day, I really like what Derek Carr is doing in this offense. I really like what Clint Kubiak has brought to this offense. And he made this offense the best parts of Derek Carr's, Alvin Kamara's, Rashid Shaheed's traits, and really brought out the best in this team. And most importantly, has them playing in a way where they feel free. And when you're playing free football, you really have no things to worry about. Whereas Sam Darnold, yes, he's proven that he can beat his team, but it was his former team, may have had more information about them, and the schedule is only going to get tougher from here on out. So for now, I would say Derek Carr to start. And I feel really confident in that prediction holding up for most of the season, because if the Saints offense really has no weaknesses, then that's a threat to the NFC South and the NFC. I really like what Derek Carr is doing in this New Orleans Saints offense. But kind of going back to this game between Seattle and Miami, I think that the big question about the Seattle D is, well, we now know that Tua's not going to be a part of this game, so how do we figure out what Miami's game plan could be going forward? Do we believe that Skylar Thompson can hurt us through the air? Can we believe that Tyreek Hill will still be effective? Or do we hone in on potentially stopping the run with Devon Achane and all the speed that comes with that? So I still think that the question that I posed here stands because of the question surrounding how Seattle will fare against fantastic offensive players. And it's not just about the quarterback, mind you, for offenses. It's about how you play. So Seattle will still be tested. But another big question is, will Tyreek Hill still be effective? Because he's now a bigger X factor than you would expect in this game because of what he can do either positively or negatively. He can either be a non-factor in this game, or Mike McDaniel trusts Skylar Thompson to have a couple of deep shots, if they're open, for Tyreek Hill. So it's all going to be a balance of how the Seattle defense thinks about their game plan, and also how Miami, who still technically has the advantage on the offensive side of the ball, how they plan to have a game script that takes advantage of their best weapons. But this game overall should be an exciting one for the weekend. Another interesting game is the Ravens-Cowboys game. Now, both of these teams, questionable losses this past week, not necessarily the best of games. Baltimore starting off 0-2 as they lost surprisingly to the Las Vegas Raiders after blowing a lead late in the fourth quarter. And then the Cowboys overall not very impressive against the Saints. So there are a lot of different storylines you can follow here, like, will CeeDee Lamb have a good big game, or the question of which QB will keep their offense most on schedule. But I'm looking at, just can these offenses get right in the first place? Because both these defenses are still tough. Yes, the Ravens lost Mike McDonald, and there are some injuries to worry about in their secondary. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is this game seems like it will focus on the defensive side of the ball. And in that case, we're going to still have to look at whether or not CeeDee Lamb will show up. Or, in terms of the Ravens, which of those weapons will pretend to be the biggest one. And I think for both of these kind of situations, you have to look at, well, which offense have I been more impressed by? And the answer is, we really don't know still. I think when you look at the Ravens, I like all the weapons they have, but their offensive line is so concerning. When I look at the Cowboys, it just seems to be the Dak and CeeDee show. So, at the end of the day, I think that some questions have to be answered about both of these offenses and quickly in order for me to feel comfortable about immediately giving you guys advice on players from both of these teams who I think would fit into your fantasy teams. But at this current juncture, I think the one question above all is, can these defenses prove they still got it? Because right now, I don't have much faith in either of them to start the season. And I think that this game could still be high scoring. I think that both of these quarterbacks will stay on schedule. I like Lamar having a lot of rushing yards in this game, and I like Dak being his usual poised self. But I just can't get past the fact that I still don't seem to have any idea about what these teams could be. So this is going to be an interesting one in terms of offense and defense, if you have players on both the offense and either one of these defenses. The last game I want to talk about, another very interesting one, the Jags and the Bills, because we have a lot of intriguing storylines. We talked about the Jags D yesterday. We talked about how underrated they have looked in their first two games, even though they took 2 losses. And we've also talked about the resurgence of Josh Allen, potentially being the QB1 right now in fantasy. And the reason why this game really stood out to me from the jump was because that the Jags D played against 2 units that in Miami and Cleveland have the big play threats. And yes, even though Cleveland really hasn't shown big play threats this season, the Miami Dolphins only had that one long pass to Tyreek Hill. And when I look at the Bills' offense, I'm thinking about how their kind of small ball approach, their smash mouth approach right now, is kind of factoring into perhaps a time where the rhythm of the offense could be off kilter in certain situations. And the Jags, like I said, don't have one big name on this defense. Maybe Josh Hines-Allen or someone of that nature or someone that import to them really stands out. But they just are a collective group who I really like in terms of playing timely defense, mainly getting takeaways, getting the field position, because on the offensive side of the ball, they've really struggled. And so the defense is really going to have to be the X factor for them in this game if they want to have any chance of going up against Buffalo's potent offense to start the year and potentially a QB1 in Josh Allen. But I think this game is going to be more about Josh Allen and how consistent he can be in this offense than, say, the Jags defense. But I still think the Jags defense is legitimate, and we'll see how it all plays out on the field Sunday. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. A lot of interesting games around the NFL, a lot of interesting storylines. But coming next, we talk about how these storylines can translate to all these injuries that have happened in the league, and we give you updates on certain players in certain situations that could be longer than we expect or could be shorter than we expect. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network, as we get a comment right off the jump from Andre. Is Kenneth Walker playing? And as a Seattle fan, you would think I knew the answer a little bit more to this question, Andre, but I actually don't know. In terms of what I hear from practice, he was a limited participant with that hand injury. So we'll see. I think that if he does play, I think he might have a limit on how many touches he gets, and that could be to the detriment of the Seattle offense. But for now, it's kind of up in the air. We still don't know how Mike McDonald presents injuries. Don't know if he's kind of like a game time decision kind of guy, or if he'll let us know in advance whether or not certain players are playing. But that is a fantastic question. I wish I had the answer for you right now, but let's just say it's up in the air. I'm kind of leaning towards no, even though he is limited in practice and could have a bigger role in tomorrow's practice. We'll see. So I think we'll have to take it by ear, and it will be a game time decision, which is kind of unfortunate if you're a fantasy football manager and you're waiting for a response. Thank you for this question because it's a good one, and one that I wanted to point out in this next segment. Injury updates, because we have a lot to go through and a short amount of time to do it in, unfortunately. Let's start off actually with some good news. We did get that breaking news. Don't know if you were watching or not, but if you weren't, Raheem Mostert is a long shot to play in that game against Seattle. I believe it is with a chest injury sustained against the Bills. We'll have to see how that injury plays out for the Miami Dolphins, who can't afford many in this future for them. But let's start off with some good news. And this is especially good news if you're a Vikings fan, especially good news if you're a fantasy football manager of Justin Jefferson. I was talking about kind of a woeful situation there for Minnesota for this game, but Justin Jefferson seems like he's going to play in this game, because in a press conference after practice today, he said yes, for sure, when asked about playing in this game. So that should excite a lot of people. We'll see how the leg injury holds up. He himself said it felt good during practice, so a lot of excitement and hype around that. Fantastic news for Vikings fans, fantasy football managers everywhere about Justin Jefferson. But let's get to the ugly news. And the ugly news isn't necessarily about, just one player. It's about whole teams right now, especially the two teams that we talked about in the last segment, the 49ers and the Rams. Let's start off with the 49ers, who are projecting to have even worse news right now. We know about McCaffrey. He's missed the first two games and could miss at least the next three on the IR. We know about Deebo Samuel, also on the IR, could miss at least 6 weeks with a calf injury. But now we also know that George Kittle and Charvarius Ward on the defense, who also could potentially lose Nick Bosa for this game after he went down in that game against Minnesota, were limited participants in today's practice. As Shapizi Sweet Spot says, K9 is considered doubtful. So that's not necessarily a good projection if you're a fantasy football owner for him. But thank you for that information. It makes it a little bit more easy to determine who you want to choose for your squad in this game. But definitely don't choose anyone outside of Jordan Mason in the 49ers backfield, because that situation is scary. But going back to the Kittle and Ward injury, I don't necessarily have that much information about the limited injuries in practice, but it certainly seems like both of those players are still sore. And for Kittle, I think he could potentially be the more likely to be out, because Charvarius Ward seems like he's just sore and he's working out some kinks in practice. So it's definitely projecting to be a little bit more positive news for the 49ers defense. But in terms of the 49ers offense, if you're looking for contingency plans, yes, as Andre said, Niners got blessed with no injuries last year. Now the injury bug has smacked them. Hate to see it. Yes, I understand. As a Seattle fan, I kind of am, secretly, happy, not necessarily happy about it, because I'm never happy about injuries, but deep down in the inside, I feel a little bit, like it's bound to happen sometime. But, it is kind of sad to see such a talented team who, when they're all on the field, can make magic happen, kind of crumble to pieces in front of our eyes. And so it's going to be a weird game, man. It's going to be a weird game, 49ers Rams, because we're not seeing any of our favorite players. So let's transition to the Rams here. Let's transition very quickly to them. Cooper Kupp. this is a very weird situation. The good news is he's not going to need a procedure on his ankle. That's the good news. The interesting news is that he's not placed on the IR, but it could be more about the fact that the Rams already have so many players on the IR that he's not. So it's not a timeline question, really. It's just the fact of the matter is the Rams are one of the most injured teams in the NFL right now, and they simply have no space to put him on the IR even if they wanted to. With that being said, it does look like a pretty serious injury, so expect a 6 to 8 week timeline there. And then for Puka Nacua, we already know about him, already on the IR, 6 weeks with that leg injury. So with the Rams and 49ers, I would imagine that there are certain secondary options they feel comfortable in, but both of these offenses right now are going to be going through it for a little bit of time. And the thing is, while it could be an opportunity for certain players to step up in the system, I think the main struggle here is, well, it's early in the season, and you're already seemingly behind the 8 ball. And both of these teams projected and thought that they would be in the playoffs. As Andre said, man, I told myself to sell Cup high after week 1. He's made of glass. Yeah, man. Cooper Kupp, when he's on the field, one of the best in the league. Definitely someone who I would recommend as a wide receiver 1 when he's healthy. But it's just a matter of, he's just not, a player who can consistently prove that he can stay on the field for long periods of time, man. It's just a matter of the fact. It's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes, especially in fantasy when you're trying your best to have good players. You're trying your best to have high-end players and balance them out with some guys that are serviceable. But now all the serviceable guys are becoming more coveted because of the injuries to your high-end guys. So it's just a weird situation. But in terms of contingency plans, if, Tutu Atwell, DeMarcus Robinson, Colby Parkinson, Brandon Ayuk, Jawan Jennings prove themselves, then that's even better for the wide receiver landscape. Because when all of these guys come back, you now know that even though all the wide receivers who are performing in their stead are going to fall in the pecking order, you now know they can add some balance to your team once all your high-end guys are healthy. So it's an interesting dichotomy to think about right now. But that's the unfortunate nature of, early season injuries. You can't necessarily plan for them, and they just hit you like a ton of bricks when they come. As Andre says, can I ask him trade questions? As always, my man, feel free to ask any trade questions you wish for certain. Not sure how much time I have left. You can have a little bit of time. We can go through some more injuries, but if you have any trade questions, anyone watching right now, if you have any trade questions, I would love to take them. But let's continue for the time being until Andre gets me his questions with some injuries right now. Let's talk about Isaiah Pacheco, shall we? Because Isaiah Pacheco's one's a little bit weird because I'm not necessarily that concerned with the Chiefs' overall outlook as an offense because of his injury. But it is one that a lot of fantasy football managers are kind of reeling over because Isaiah Pacheco was one of those guys who was technically between being a high-end guy as Andre gets, I'm thinking of moving Garrett Wilson for Amon-Ra St. Brown. Well, that one hits home because both of them are on my fantasy squad. So this is an interesting question for me because it's calling into question 2 of my players who I drafted very high in my drafts that I had a lot of high hopes for, but haven't necessarily been performing very well so far. But in terms of, trading one for the other, if you're moving for Amon-Ra, I think that's a smarter choice in the long run. And after last night's performance, you might think, well, as Hunter18 enters the chat, thank you for being here, Hunter. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section. I will get to them. But concerning this trade, I think I would take it at this current juncture in time. As weird as it sounds considering what the Lions' offense is right now and how Jared Goff's been performing, I just think that Amon-Ra St. Brown is worthy of all the plaudits. I think that he will eventually find his footing. The Rams will continue to try to get him the football. As Hunter, I will get to your trade offer between Brian Thomas or start between Brian Thomas or Cam Akers eventually, but in terms of this Andre trade, Garrett Wilson for Amon-Ra, I would accept it. I love Garrett Wilson a lot, but right now it seems to me like Aaron Rodgers is comfortable spreading the ball around as a passer right now. And then going to Hunter's question, as Andre asked another one. Going to Hunter's question real quickly, I think Brian Thomas could be an interesting start. I think that in terms of this offense going forward, the Jags will try and get Brian Thomas more incorporated. And if he is proving to be more vertical in this offense, I think that, Trevor Lawrence's deep ball is one of the most underrated ones in the league. And so they can get a lot of verticality in the offense, get a lot of targets, whereas Cam Akers, I don't really like him as a running back anymore. Kind of lost a lot of value over the years. So I would start Brian Thomas in a PPR league. And the final question, Andre, I'm going to offer Wilson and Ridley for Amon-Ra and maybe B-Rob, who is on his bench. Is that a strong enough offer? I think that Wilson and Ridley for Amon-Ra, and I believe you're talking about Bijan Robinson on his bench. I think that is a fantastic trade, and it could be a fleece. It's a bit risky one because he might think that Wilson and Ridley aren't necessarily the best return possible for this trade. But in terms of, like for like players, Garrett Wilson and Amon-Ra are very similar in terms of how I view them in terms of fantasy implications. And then Calvin really isn't that bad. It's just that his quarterback is bad. So I think that it adds a lot of value, and it's a pretty even trade. So I think that would be a strong enough offer. And it's a 2-for-2, so you're not necessarily dinging a carrot for him either by offering him 3, and you're not playing low ball. It's Brian Robinson, Andre says. I think that's still a good offer. I like Brian Robinson a lot. For the Commanders, going to get a lot of touches there in the run game. Really like him. I think he's going to supplant Austin Eckler as the starting running back in that system. So I really like that outcome. So thank you guys for your comments. I appreciate it, but I do want to get to some more injuries before we go to our next segment really quickly here. Pacheco, fractured fibula, out 6 weeks. Don't buy anyone in the Chiefs backfield. Yes, they did sign Kareem Hunt, the practice squad. Could be interesting value, but again, it's between Pirine, Steele, and him. As Andre said, I really regret trading Cook and Rice for Pacheco and Olave. I'm so mad thinking about it. Yeah, Cook and Rice for Pacheco and Olave. It wasn't the best of trades, but at least, maybe Olave, even though he's fallen in the pecking order, will still add value for the New Orleans Saints. But Pacheco one was, the one. As he says, I also want to try and get Rice back with a 2-for-1 trade. That would be something that could be an interesting one looking forward. But the final couple injuries I want to get before we have to head to break here. A.J. Brown as well. A.J. Brown pretending to miss a lot more time than expected. Kind of an unfortunate injury because I believe he sustained it pre-game, that hamstring injury. Couldn't miss a couple of weeks, though, in that offense. So look out for that. But without further ado, we have to go to a quick break here. And our final segment of the day and the week will be about college fantasy football games, and most importantly, the implications that come with them. We'll be right back to close the show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast with that segment. Hello everyone and welcome back to the final segment here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We come back to another comment before we go into our final segment of the day from Andre. I didn't take your advice that Jefferson and Jacobs for Walker and Chase offer. I'm a terrible GM. Jacobs and Jefferson so much better. Yeah, well, in terms of overall health, that trade definitely seems like a bad one because, Jefferson actually going to be pretending to play in this game against the Texans this weekend. And Jacobs, even though Jordan Love's timeline to return is shortening, still adds a lot of value to that Packers backfield. So it was kind of a bad trade. But don't worry about it. Walker and Chase, I think, in time will be interesting additions. But you never know. But let's transition to our last segment of the day here. Let's get some college football in before the weekend starts. And this one is going to be about the big games and the college side of things for fantasy implications. We have a lot of interesting games. We're getting more and more into conference play here as college football enters the weeds, like I like to say, this part of the season. And each of these games really is about position groups or players who have proved that they have already been competent fantasy players for your fantasy college football teams, but just need to show me more. So let's start off with a new Big Ten game with a new participant, new representative, and a team that doesn't necessarily look like a defending champion anymore, USC, Michigan. And so let's talk about both sides here. For USC, I think this game is going to be all about whether or not you can trust Miller Moss, whether it be as just a fantasy college football player for the rest of the season, or in a dynasty league once he enters the NFL. A lot of people are actually very high on him for what he showed in that game against LSU, the poise he had in leading that game-winning touchdown drive against LSU. And it's a built ground and pound in the ground, but I think that they're going to do it with their running backs because Donovan Edwards and Khalil Munnings, like I said, are the best parts of this team. And right now, I think that once you really look at, both these teams and how they fit in terms of their playing style, I think it's about getting Miller Moss comfortable, and it's about, if you're Michigan, trying to continue with your run game because that's the only thing that's going to make your bread and butter in terms of moving the ball on the field with your offense. Because right now, this definitely feels like the ball is in USC's court here. I really like both sides of the football for USC. And if you're Michigan, you can't be feeling too good about where your program is headed, especially for the season, and as you're going to have much more tougher games on your schedule coming up. So, for this game, definitely very player-based. It's definitely very heavy. As Andre said, do you like Brown's defense this week against the Giants? I do. I think that, like I said yesterday, they're still going to be a top 5 defense, even though I personally don't think they'll be the number 1